Hello, and welcome to my Bryan 101 Fundamentals video, where I'll be going over some of the introductory information for all you new Bryan players out there. I want to preface by saying that if you're an advanced level Bryan or a high intermediate looking for some information, I'm sorry, this video probably won't provide you with the most insight that you're looking for. But if you're just starting off in the game and you're looking to get your feet wet and hit the ground running, then you've come to the right place, my friends. In this video, we'll be looking at the character's strengths, weaknesses, his top 20 moves, as well as his punishes. There are some moves in here that I know you guys won't necessarily agree with me, but in choosing these moves, I decided that 20 was a good number because any more I felt would be particularly daunting for new players. In future videos, I'll definitely be going over some of Bryan's remaining arsenal moves outside of these 20. So please sit back, relax, enjoy the video, and if you're super serious, sit upright, grab a pen, notepad, or whatever, and get ready to jot some notes. Thanks. Bryan is a very solid character who can play up close and pressure his opponent, or play at the mid-range and space out his opponent. But more often than not, in order to play Bryan properly, will require kind of knowing when to pressure and when to kind of back off. Darting back and forth, if you will, trying to find the correct spacing, reading the opponent, not overemphasizing your offense on the character and overextending, and kind of when you get the life lead, just lean back a little bit. Bryan does have very decent buttons up close, but a handful of them are punishable. However, if you make the right read on your opponent at times, it's not so bad. Additionally, it will also require your opponent in some circumstances to make the right read in order to punish Bryan on his moves, because some of them are delayable, some of them they have strings attached to them, and they have multiple variations to them. But to make up for this little weakness that Bryan has for his punishable pokes and punishable up-close game, he does have extremely powerful and really hard-hitting counter-hit moves. And a good Bryan is going to know when to maximize and capitalize on that, because all his counter-hit moves lead to massive damage and wall carry. And once at the wall, Bryan can really just turn into a nightmare to deal with, because he gets monstrous damage on his wall splats. And because of his unique taunt, he can just really bully his opponent at the wall over and over. And this taunt game, I'm going to say right now, that is not going to be covered in this guide, but in future guides I will be covering it, because I feel like this is currently outside of the scope of beginning and fundamental Bryans, and it's not something I want to get into right now, but definitely in future videos. So with that, the introduction is out of the way, and now we can get to the strengths and weaknesses of Bryan. Great combo damage and wall carry is something that Bryan truly excels at. At any point in time Bryan manages to land a counter hit or a launcher, he never really has to settle for less than great damage and wall carry. While some of the cast might struggle with either wall carry or kind of damage, Bryan really here excels at both. And with even some of the easier bread and butter combos, he can do a substantial amount of damage. So it's not always necessary to go for, his optimal damage or his optimal wall carry combos. They kind of generally take care of themselves for the most part, even if you stick with the bread and butter combos. 14 frame launcher. Bryan's great combo potential and damage, in part, is contributed to the fact that he has a 14 frame standing launcher, aka Jet Upper. The majority of the cast actually doesn't have a 14 frame launcher, so the fact that Bryan does means that he can punish a lot of things that the majority of the cast can't. While most characters have to resort to pokes or strings that might knock down the opponent, Bryan can really just lay on the hurt and launch them. Insane wall game. So once Bryan has either comboed you or pushed you to the corner, he just becomes this absolute monster to deal with. And part of what makes Bryan's wall game so good is the fear that Bryan can inflict with a single wall splat, just one wall splat. While a lot of Bryan's mids and lows out in the open are just annoying to deal with because they chip you, they lock you a little bit, they put you in, you know, minus frames. At the wall, they're just really very oppressive tools because they either wall splat you or they lock you down, preventing you from getting out. And just the sheer amount of frustration that Bryan can have, preventing you from moving away from the wall and just wall splatting you and just knocking all your health down is just what really makes him so good at the wall. Unblockable taunt. So unique to Bryan is his unblockable taunt, and while this is a little slow to start up, it can, in a lot of situations, crack open even the most defensive of players. You have players who don't want to press buttons, they're just blocking, they're guessing right on the lows, and they're just waiting for Bryan to make a move. Well, in this case, Bryan can just throw out his taunt and really just put on some pressure, just to let the opponent know, hey, you can't block forever. And additionally, at the wall, this can really be an issue because with just a single taunt, it can just turn the whole game around. He's wall splatted you, and now you're gonna have to eat this massive wall damage. Fantastic in the mid-range and keep out. And yeah, this is an area where Bryan truly excels. I probably should have put this as the #1 thing for Bryan's strengths, but Bryan really doesn't have a problem when keeping opponents out in the mid-range, which is where he wants to be and really excels. For the most part, all of these keep out tools are all safe. They're not plus for the most part, but they are safe. And you know, if they try to rush in or overly aggressive, then they'll get hit by these. And a lot of these all lead to fantastic combo damage and juggles. Lack of panic buttons. To say Bryan doesn't have any panic buttons might be incorrect, but they are situational and for the most part are fairly slow compared to the rest of the cast's panic buttons and moves. For starters, being slow means that they can be poked out of, and in worst case scenarios they can actually be juggled. This is something that is very dangerous given the right circumstances. So Bryan really has to work to get out of pressure through moving, stepping, just getting correct reads. Poor punishment game. Bryan has no real standing 11 or 12 frame punish, and his 13 frame punish move is kind of lackluster for the most part. So between frames 11, 12, and 13, he really has to resort to just jab poking and his jab punish, which is his 10 frame punisher. And not until frame 14 does he really get something that's kind of really chunky. As for his while standing punishment goes, he has an 11 and a 12, but nothing at 13 and 14, and at 15 he gets a while standing punish. But at 15, pretty much a majority of the cast, I would say, gets it. So his while standing punishment game is just on average so-so. Poking can be risky with Bryan. Okay, so to some extent, Bryan has to really commit to his pokes because they're quote-unquote safe-ish. That doesn't mean that they're actually safe. Some of them have delays and the timing can be changed, but they can still be read and poked back. Also, if the opponent gets a correct read, then Bryan can potentially be launched for them. And as stated earlier, Bryan's pokes aren't exactly punishable, some of them, but they can result in him being poked back, being at minus frames, or even worse, like knocked down. So overall, poking can be kind of risky with Bryan. Execution. At the beginner level, Bryan has a lot of key and core moves that can be difficult to execute because they're locked behind either quarter circle forward motions, quarter circle back motions, or even, forward motions. For beginners, at the beginner and maybe intermediate level, it can be difficult to get out consistently and on demand and just really quickly, like one after another. At top levels, Bryan's taunt combos, his magic 4 combos, and even some of his optimal damage combos, they can all be kind of hard to do actually, because they require a fair bit of execution to pull off, especially in the clutch. Even for some pros, sometimes from time to time they really just drop them. If you watch some of the games, the harder to execute combos, sometimes the pros miss it. Even forward motions, I've seen them miss it. So yeah, execution can be a real barrier to entry, as well as a barrier to mastering Bryan at the top level as well. So the first move that we're going to talk about is 1-2-1 and 1-2-3. These two moves really complement one another in that 1-2-1 is a high mid, and 1-2-3 is a high low. And these really work in tandem with one another because they allow for a mini mix-up for Bryan. So 1-2-1 and 1-2-3, both of these strings start up very quickly, but the last hit of neither of these jail, which means that the 1 and 1-2-1 and the 3 and 1-2-3, they both can be blocked if your opponent is fast enough after being hit by the first two, unless it's a counter hit. And speaking of counter hits, 1-2-1 and 1-2-3 both manage to get counter hits because your opponent's disrespecting them. You can get a mini juggle off of them. On 1-2-1 you can get something more substantial, and on 1-2-3 on counter hits you can get a run up quarter circle back 4. And additionally, 1-2-1, the last hit can be delayed. Depending on how much you want to delay it, the timing can vary. Down forward 1-1-1-1-2, aka machine gun blow. That's a classic Bryan move, and it locks down the opponent from moving, and also it grants Bryan some great mental frame advantage, even if it's not finished. Machine gun blow, it's a relatively slow and sluggish mid coming out at 15 frames as opposed to 13 frames for majority of the cast. But this move is really powerful because at any point in time, if one of the ones connect, then the whole string can be finished and Bryan gets chunky size damage. With just one activation of down forward 1, Bryan is safe at -5, but any additional ones that he decides to tack on afterwards, after the initial hit, automatically puts him at -10. While this might seem bad, it's pretty decent if you consider the fact that the opponent never really knows when Bryan's finishing the rest of the string. If he does manage to get the 2 at the end, then it gives him a chunky size damage and puts him at +1. But if he decides to finish the 2 and the 2 is blocked, then he is at -15, which is liable to be launch punished by the majority of the cast. So most of the time it's best not to hit the 2 unless you know your opponent's going to be pressing a button or you've hit confirmed it. Down forward 2-1 and down forward 2-3. So next we'll be talking about these two moves and in conjunction with one another, because each of these serves to complement one another. Down forward 2-1, this is Bryan's fastest mid string, coming out at 13 frames, and down forward 2-1 serves twofold. 1, to check crouching opponents, and 2, to poke at players who are a little too button happy. This string does jail on natural hit, and if the first hit connects, but does not jail if the first hit is blocked. Since this move does not jail, this means that the second hit is a duckable high, meaning you could potentially be launched for it. So don't get too predictable with this move, as you will potentially be launched. Oh, and one more thing before we move on to the next move. The first hit of the string, down forward 2, is an elbow, meaning it cannot be parried by conventional parries. So it's good to know if your opponent's a little too parry happy, down forward 2-1 will snuff them out. So down forward 2-3 is the other variation out of Bryan's down forward 2 poke, and this complements his down forward 2-1 because down forward 2-1 the second hit is a high, and down forward 2-3 the second hit is a mid, meaning that it will attempt to hit any opponents who try to duck. Down forward 2-3, unlike down forward 2-1, is not a natural combo on hit. Also, down forward 2-3, if your opponent decides to press buttons after the 3 or during the 3, they will potentially eat a very meaty counter hit launcher. And while Bryan does get a little bit of pushback from down forward 2-3, the last hit is -13. It does provide a little bit of pushback, but most characters can still punish this in some way, shape, or form. Back 1. Now, this is a staple pressure tool that allows Bryan to really lock down his opponent. Whether this move is blocked or it hits the opponent, Bryan will be left with some plus frames to bully his opponent. On block, this just gets Bryan about 3 frames on block to establish some powerful mix-ups and mind games. On hit, however, Bryan gets a massive +7 frames, in addition to forcing crouch. This absolutely gains Bryan free reign over anything he wants to do, pretty much. And on counter hit, this attack gives Bryan a very big counter hit launcher. One note about this move is to not be too predictable with it, as it can be sidestepped left or right, however the opponent chooses to sidestep. And like a lot of Bryan's moves, this is an elbow, so it cannot be parried by conventional means. 3+4. Now this is a fantastic long-range move that serves twofold. One, for spacing out the opponent and keeping them at a distance, and then 2, for fishing out counter hits from would-be overly aggressive opponents. Unlike its look-alike move, Bryan's down forward 2-3 string, this move is much harder to punish. While on paper it is -13, which a majority of the cast would be able to block and punish, because of the pushback that it does give Bryan, it's actually considerably harder to punish. Additionally, on counter hit, Bryan is granted a huge counter hit crumple stun combo. So at any point you connect, you get massive payouts. One word of caution though when using this move, it is vulnerable to sidestep right, and any opponents who attempt to sidestep left will be clipped by it. Other than its vulnerability really to sidestep right, this move can kind of just be thrown out willy-nilly in the mid-range where it will connect, and that's the keyword. Make sure that it connects and it does not whiff. 1+2. This is a homing move that comes out pretty quickly at 17 frames. On the surface, Bryan's 1+2 doesn't really look menacing because it doesn't do a whole lot of damage, nor does it give really a combo. But in reality, it's kind of a nasty hitting move, because on hit this grants Bryan +6 frames, which allows him to really lay on some pressure and bully his opponent. And on counter hit, it's really interesting because it forces the opponent to be awkwardly turned. They do a back turn, in which really limits the opponent's options to really move and attack. Additionally, Bryan has a 2 extension out of this 1+2, which knocks down on hit, and it does crumple stun if it's a counter hit. So if your opponent thinks that you're just doing 1+2 and tries to press buttons, you can catch them with the 2 extension. Forward 4-1. A mid-reaching 2-hit string that provides Bryan a launcher on hit. While this move is too slow to be throwing out just willy-nilly in up-close fighting, it is best used as a whiff punisher, because boy, it has a weird startup animation in the way that Bryan takes a big step forward before initiating this move, and its range is very deceptive. Because I mean, just look at this move, how he's punishing Kazuya from so far away. This move is absolutely crazy because it punishes things it has no business of even reaching. But as good as it is, do be wary that the first hit of the string is -9, which is safe. However, the last string is -13 when forces crouch, which means every member of the cast has some sort of punish to this move, and a few can even launch it if blocked. Forward back to the classic jet upper, Bryan's fastest launching attack, coming out at 14 frames. Only about a dozen characters in this game are able to launch at this speed and faster, and most are coming out at 15 frames. So Bryan happens to be one of the lucky few. On hit, this gives fantastic damage and excellent wall carry, even with just bread and butter combos. And on block, it is completely safe at just -7. The only real downside to this attack is that it's one, an unorthodox input at forward back motion, and two, it hits high, so your opponent can duck and punish it. So don't get too predictable with this move out in the open. Sometimes it's best used just as a punisher. Forward 3. A close range, moderately hitting knee. While this move does slightly advance Bryan a little bit forward, it will not connect with any opponents who are further than just one backdash distance away. It's not a bad move to really throw out if your opponent is potentially hesitating to press a button and you're up close, because forward 3 does leave Bryan neutral on block when performed at just point blank range and a little bit outside of point blank range. And it will leave Bryan actually at +2 frames if it connects at its max distance, which is just a hair's distance from one backdash away. While it is a little bit slow to come out at 16 frames for mid, it does provide Bryan a very beefy juggle opportunity on counter hits. So don't hesitate to throw this out up close if your opponent's hesitant. Quarter circle back 3, aka hatchet kick. This is a chunky hitting low attack that advances Bryan forward. Up until now, you've probably noticed that the majority of Bryan's best tools are either highs or mids. So a hatchet kick is really going to be Bryan's predominant low that will allow him to get in some beefy damage against opponents who are only stand blocking. This move has very decent range because Bryan takes a step forward. If you look here, takes a step forward before swinging his leg. He can reach opponents up to 2 backdashes away. While this move is a low attack, it will not hit grounded opponents. On block, it is -13, but outside of a few characters, Bryan's really not going to be launch punished for it. And on hit, Bryan gets himself a nice 4 frames, allowing him to continue pressuring or moving. And on counter hit, he's guaranteed a free quarter circle back 4 follow-up. Quarter circle back 4, aka soccer kick. This is going to be Bryan's main mix-up counterpart to hatchet kick. Soccer kick and hatchet kick really play off one another and cover one another's weaknesses. Since hatchet kick comes out at 21 frames and soccer kick comes out at 19 frames, the two are basically indistinguishable from each other on startup. Additionally, these two moves have identical ranges. Well, almost identical ranges. They both hit characters 2 backdashes away, and should your opponent suspect a hatchet kick, a low, throwing out soccer kick will net Bryan a decent launcher on hit. On block, Bryan is -12, which means he is punishable. This is a useful move outside of mix-ups. Any opponents who are unwilling to get off the ground immediately, you can hit them with a soccer kick and flip them. And a small note on opponents who are on the floor: if your opponent does roll on the ground, they can avoid being hit by soccer kick if they time it properly. 4-4-2, aka Mach Punch. This is a classic Bryan move all the way back to Tekken 3, and it happens to be his Power Crush move. Mach Punch is a fast forward advancing high that, I'm going to say this again. Mach Punch is a fast forward advancing high. I want you to look at this. I want you to let you know that this is 3 backdashes away and see how it hits. It comes out at 14 frames from block and 16 frames out in open play, but the 16 frames out in open play can be very hard because of the forward notation. This move is best used to catch overly forward advancing opponents, or it could be used to relieve pressure from Bryan from opponents who are using slower mids and slower highs. Additional notes can be that Bryan gets a free run up quarter circle back 4 if your opponent does not tech roll this. And while it is -10 on block theoretically, because of the pushback, only a handful of characters will punish this effectively. But at the wall, it is much easier to punish because the pushback is significantly reduced. So a majority of the cast will be able to punish this at the wall. Do note that, like I said before, this is a high hitting attack, so if you get too predictable with this, they will duck and you will eat a launcher for this. Alright, so don't get too predictable with this attack. 4-4-4, aka Mach Kick. This is another classic Bryan move, but unlike Mach Punch, Mach Kick does not possess the crushing capabilities that Mach Punch does. However, it has unique attributes to itself. 1. For starters, it is a fast homing attack. Well, moderately fast homing attack. 2. On block, it forces the opponent into crouch, and you're at -10. What does this mean? This means that aside from a few characters in the game, you're not going to be punished by anything other than a crouching jab. And 3. This is the most ridiculous one of all. On the startup frames, Bryan takes a small sidestep left before executing this kick, which in essence makes it a pseudo parry for Bryan, allowing him to evade certain attacks with this when timed properly. Now I want you to take a look at this. Take a look at this. Look at this. Look at this. You see how Bryan takes a small sidestep left and evades the attack and hits? Right, this is ridiculous. And 4, on counter hit, Bryan is guaranteed very good damage and very good wall carry. So, unlike Mach Punch, it doesn't have armor, but it has a lot of other good abilities attached to it. And like Mach Punch though, it has its same weaknesses, which is that it can be ducked and launch punished. Don't get too predictable with this. You will be launched if you are very predictable with this. Quarter circle back 2-4. A mid-range 2-hitting string that covers some decent space. This move can either be used to whiff punish your opponent, or it can be used to bait impatient opponents into running into the last hit of the string. The last hit of the string, you may notice, is almost identical to Bryan's 4-4-4 Mach Kick, but it does not have the evasive properties of Mach Kick. So, having said that, it does share Mach Kick's weaknesses in that it can be ducked and launch punished, and this string does not jail on block. While quarter circle back 2 part of the string looks like Bryan's down forward 2, quarter circle back 2 is not an elbow, which means it can be parried by conventional parries. Back 4, a close range mid-hitting knee that grants Bryan great advantage on hit and very little disadvantage on block. On hit and on counter hit, Bryan gets plus 15 frames. What does this mean? This means that Bryan gets a free Mach Punch. Though the timing can be very strict because Bryan's Mach Punch comes out at 14 frames, you do note that you get a free Mach Punch if you land a back 4 out in open play or at the wall. But at the wall, it gets juicier. Bryan, if he connects a back 4 at the wall, then he is guaranteed a free jet upper into a 50% health damage combo. Out in open play, back 4 is rather difficult to punish at -10. Aside from a few characters who have long-reaching arms and limbs, he can't really be punished. And aside from that, even at the wall, most of the cast will probably have trouble punishing this move. That's just how good the pushback on this is on block. So with that in mind, this makes back for an ideal move to throw out when your opponent's back is to the wall. Up or up forward 4, aka Orbital Heal, another classic Bryan move. This is a mid-hitting, low-crushing launcher on hit and safe on block. This move is excellent sometimes to just simply throw out in the mid-range because of its long active windows and its relatively short recovery. It is used mostly to low crush, or it's used to space out your opponent from being too overly aggressive. Additionally, its range is very deceptive because where Bryan's foot starts in this animation, see where it starts? It's not the max range at which it can hit an opponent. And you can see where it's clipping the opponent. Look at this. This is ridiculous. Again, by the way, I'm saying a lot of look at this because it's ridiculous. You see where the foot hits? Yeah, that's its max range. And it creates a sort of a little bit of a vacuum effect when opponents are close by. Up close, this move is not a great idea to throw out if you don't have a read on your opponent, because you can potentially be float jabbed and hit into a combo on the startup frames. However, if you do get a read on an opponent who is performing a low attack, it's a great move to use because it will low crush. Down back 3, a very fast, high crushing low attack. This move, because it starts up at only 16 frames, is unseeable and therefore a good option to just sneak in a little bit of chip damage here and there against your opponent. While it is generically -1 on hit, it leaves Bryan in full crouching, therefore limiting his options. On counter hit, this leaves Bryan at +4, which is rather interesting because this gives him more options for mix-ups and allowing him more freedom to move. This move's reach and its tracking is pretty good actually. So it can be used to check sidestepping opponents who are moderate distance away, as most opponents are probably not looking to block low immediately after sidestepping. If an opponent does block this move, it is -12 and therefore punishable depending on which range it is blocked at. Go. Down 4, another of Bryan's fast low pokes. This move, while it does come out slightly faster than down back 3 by just 1 frame and 15 frames, it lacks the high crushing evasion properties that down back 3 does. To make up for this though, the lack of evasion that this move has, Bryan is completely neutral on hit and leaves him in a standing state, so giving him more options. Also, unlike down back 3, down 4 is only -11 on block. And while theoretically this move is punishable by a lot of the cast at while standing 4, it requires your opponent to 1, be on point with their punish game, even if it's blocked, and also if Bryan spaces this out correctly. It is very, very difficult, and not very many people can actually punish this because of the pushback it gives and its reach. Full crouch down 4-4. aka Northern Cross. This is a mid-hitting high crush launcher on counter hit at only -10 on block. This move is excellent at being a deterrent to opponents who might otherwise be a little too jab happy or high attack heavy, since it's performed out of a crouching state. On natural hits, this move leaves the opponent in a spin state where they can guard, leaving Bryan at +13 frames. Should the opponent decide to disregard the spin state and press buttons, Bryan can get some massive counter hit potential with some of his mid attacks. Speaking of counter hit attacks, Bryan is able to convert this into a launcher on counter hit, dishing out sizable damage and respectable wall carry. Sidestep 1. This is a hard-hitting, evasive back fist attack. Sidestep 1 is particularly good when used to evade some moderately slow linear attacks, since it has a built-in sidestep motion. On attack, this hits and stuns your opponent, really laying on the hurt. On block, this is completely safe at just -5, so it's not necessarily a big deal if it's blocked. However, do note that this attack does hit high, so it can be ducked by the opponent and launched, and the whiff recovery is not particularly good either, so don't get too predictable and don't whiff this attack. Back 1+2, Bryan's Rage Drive. This is a fantastic Rage Drive as it is a souped up version of Bryan's Back 1. It comes out faster, launches on hit, forces opponents on crouch when blocked, and gives Bryan major frame advantage when it is blocked. The only downside to this move is that it is linear, just like Back 1. However, it tracks much better to sidestep left than Back 1 does. It still cannot be used as a panic move as it comes out in 18 frames, so any faster moves will stuff it out. The damage, on the other hand, that this can lead to is round ending. It can deal upwards of 89 points of damage when it does hit for a full combo. One particularly interesting thing to note is that Bryan performs a taunt after Back 1+2 hits, and it launches the opponent. If timed properly, Bryan has enough time to do the taunt, cancel it, and still have access to his Blue Spark Mach Punch. And the timing is, as soon as you hear Bryan laugh, you cancel the taunt with any direction or any button. Down forward 1+2, Bryan's Rage Art. This is not a particularly notable Rage Art, because like most Rage Arts in this game, it hits mid, starts up at 20 frames, and is launchable on block at -22. Use this only if you get a read on your opponent, as you will be left very vulnerable on block and on whiff. Do note that one notable quality about this is that after the Rage Art hits, Bryan gains an uncancelable taunt animation, gaining you access to Bryan's Blue Spark Mach Punch. But you don't have to worry about this because you will recover from the taunt before your opponent will be able to hit you, so it's quite a good thing if you do manage to land this. So Bryan has two Punishers as his 10 frame Punisher. 1-4 and 2-3. The latter 2-3 gives you more damage and gives you more frames on hit. However, its range is not that of 1-4. 1-4 has more range, so more often than not you will be able to punish with 1-4, whereas 2-3 sometimes it won't reach. In scenarios where you're not sure, just stick to 1-4 for your 10, 11, and 12 frame Punishers. 13 frame Punisher, Bryan only has access to one move, which is his down forward 2-1. This, as we discussed earlier, is his fastest mid string, starting off as an elbow. Some people might be wondering why not use 2-3 as a Punisher because it has more damage. Well, down forward 2-1 has more range, so in some scenarios it's better to use down forward 2-1 even though it gives less damage. At 14, 15, 16, and 17 frame standing Punisher, Bryan has two moves. One is forward back 2, aka jet upper, and 2, forward 2, which is Mach Punch. More often than not, you'll be going to jet upper for your launching Punisher, but in certain circumstances, say for instance Paul's Phoenix Smasher, you'll have to use forward 2 because jet upper just won't reach. Bryan has two 18 frame standing Punishers, forward 4-1 and back 1+2 when he has rage, his Rage Drive. One note is that some people might ask why not use jet upper as a launcher as opposed to forward 4-1, and the reason is that forward 4-1 gives you more damage as a launcher than jet upper does. At 11 frame while standing, Bryan gets a while standing 4. This is absolutely nothing to write home about as it is a very standard 11 frame while standing Punisher, giving you a little bit of damage and some frames on hit. Additionally, just use this for quick low pokes that your opponents are hitting you with and you block. At 12, 13, and 14 frame while standing, Bryan has while standing 3, which is not that great for 13 and 14 frame punishes, but it's all he's got, so you kind of have to make do with what you have. For a while standing punisher at 15, 16, 17, and 18, Bryan has access to his while standing 1. This is his while standing launcher, his fastest while standing launcher. Coming out at 15 frames, use this to punish your opponents who are throwing out slightly slower lows, and launch them and get a juggle for it. Bryan's last while standing punisher and most damaging while punisher comes in at 19 frames as while standing 2 forward 2, also known as Fisherman's Slam. This is predominantly used for very slow recovering lows as well as stagger state lows, lows where your opponent is stunned for a second when it's blocked. This gives huge damage on block and can lead to a 50% health combo. Alright guys, that does about it for this video, and thank you so much if you sat through all of it. It turned out to be a lot longer than I had anticipated. We went through Bryan's strengths, his weaknesses, his fundamentals for key moves, and his punish game. Please leave me a like and subscribe if you really enjoyed the content, because that really means a lot to me. And additionally, you know, if there's something that you want to comment below, please feel free to do so. Let's get a discussion going, and hopefully in the near future I will be bringing more content regarding Bryan's combos, his bread and butter combos for beginners. Alright, that does about it for me. Thanks so much for watching, and have a good one.